Howdy folks, and welcome back to War Thunder with the Mighty Jingles. Today's video is about a phenomenon that I have noticed since patch 1.37 came out in War Thunder, and it's to do with bombers, in that we'd be losing game after game after game, and we still had aircraft to fly. There were still ground targets that needed killing. But what had been happening was people on the enemy team in bombers were winning the matches by blowing away the area ground targets and running down the ticket counter at the top of the screen. In some cases, within minutes of the match starting. In particular, those games where you can win outright just by blowing away the enemy airbase. Generally speaking, if you see two guys on the enemy team, and I noticed this pattern developing through long and bitter experience, two guys in the enemy team in Year 2 bombers, if you do not shoot them down, right, they're flying together, and they pick the Year 2 for a reason, because a Year 2 with a full bomb load, or rather two Year 2s with a full bomb load, only have to bomb your airbase twice to win the game. Right, they'll wipe out your airbase with 2 bombing runs, and it does not take them very long to do it. Now that in itself isn't anything new. Two Year 2s working together have always been able to do that. Which is why, in particular, when you check the team list at the start of a game and you see two guys flying a pair of Year 2s, they're a priority target. What hasn't changed is that nobody wants to go after them. Everybody wants somebody else to go after them, but nobody wants to be the one to do it, because climbing up to 6 kilometers altitude basically means that the best possible scenario is you're going to kill 2 bombers. Meanwhile, everybody else is having a great time down below 1 kilometer altitude, shooting up ground targets, farming fighter kills, walking away with a buttload of XP and credits while you've killed 2 bombers. But none of that's particularly new. For a long time, success or failure of the mission has generally depended on somebody sacrificing their chance at earning a decent amount of XP and credits out of the game by being the one to climb to high altitude and go after the bombers. Now, previously in War Thunder, being the one to go after the bombers wasn't all bad news for a couple of reasons. Shooting down bombers was far too easy, which is one of the reasons. And secondly, hardly anybody played bombers because shooting down bombers was far too easy. And so you didn't have to loiter around at altitude for very long, taking out those high priority bomber targets. And once you dealt with them, you were at high altitude. You pretty much had the pick of the battlefield at that point. You could go where you like and dive on whoever you wanted and get back into the fight. Now, it's difficult to be too critical of Gaijin for implementing changes in patch 1.37 to make quality of life improvements for bomber pilots, because being a bomber pilot really sucked. And there definitely have been quality of life improvements for bomber pilots in patch 1.37, which I feel were needed. But it's a combination of, certainly in my experience, both shooting at bombers and flying bombers, they're nowhere near as easy as they used to be to kill. I mean, sure, you can still get your pilot killed and lose the aircraft like that, and sure, every now and then you're going to take a lucky shot and have your aircraft blown in half. But overall, certainly from a durability perspective, bombers do live a little longer and are a little harder to shoot down than they used to be. Now, that in and of itself isn't really an issue. I think it's an overdue change, and it's very welcome. You know, you can still kill them, it requires a little bit more work on your behalf. However, that's not all that's changed. Now we've got area bombing targets in the game, and again, this is something that I do feel needed to be in the game for the benefit of bomber pilots, because it's very difficult to hit a moving medium tank from 6 kilometers up with a 500-pound bomb dropped by a bomber, and there was very little for bomber pilots to actually do. If they wanted to hit anything, they had to get down to low altitude or be very good at dropping bombs. And it just wasn't fair that in order for a bomber pilot to be successful, he had to be so much better at doing his job than a fighter jockey. So they introduced area bombing targets, which I think was a great idea. But the way in which they've introduced these area bombing targets, taken in combination with the fact that bombers are undeniably harder to kill than they were before, is that it is now entirely possible for you to lose a game while still having plenty of aircraft to fly and while there are still ground targets that need killing. And the game is over purely and simply because of the damage inflicted on these area bombing targets. And it's happening for a number of reasons. More people are flying bombers now because bombers are more fun to fly now. There's more for bombers to do. The bombers live longer than they used to, so more people are flying their bombers, and this is a good thing. I just feel that they've taken it just that little bit too far in one direction by the amount of damage that a bomber can inflict on your ticket counter at the top of the screen by dumping his bombs on an area target. And I was losing game after game after game on this particular day playing War Thunder, and it was usually down to the enemy team employing one tactic. And it usually involved 3 or 4 of the enemy pilots who would select a lineup that consisted of nothing but bombers. And they would load up one of those bombers and just make a shallow dive, building up as much speed as possible, and head straight for one of these area ground targets. Dump all their bombs, and then probably get shot down, and do exactly the same thing in another bomber. And by the time they'd done that once each, before hardly anybody had been shot down and hardly anybody had knocked out any of the ground targets, your team's ticket counter is almost gone and the match is almost over before anybody can do anything. And it just seems as if they've placed far too much emphasis on the amount of damage that dropping bombs on these area targets can actually do to your team's chances of winning. I'd lost games in 3 or 4 minutes, literally, game's over that fast. When you press tab and you see that the enemy team is 60% bombers, it's just no, previously in War Thunder, fighter pilots were rubbing their hands when they saw that sort of situation, just thinking, haha, lunch, om nom 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 nom. Today I will feast on the tears of bomber pilots. Yeah, well that was prior to patch 1.37. Nowadays, you press tab and you see 60% of the enemy team on a ground strike mission consist of bomber aircraft. Just forget it. There's nothing you can do. You are going to lose. It's gone that far in the other direction. The combination of hits to your victory counter at the top of the screen from that many people in bombers, all going for your airbase, your ground targets, going for the area bombing targets, means that by the time you've dealt with the first bomber that everybody's flying, your ticket counter just is never going to recover. You're already 3/5 lost, and then you have to deal with the second wave of bombers. And it's a peculiar situation to be in, because the majority of these changes definitely needed to be done, but the combination of all of them at the same time, with bombers being, a lot more fun to fly, and with the introduction of the area ground targets and the amount of damage to your team's chances of winning that bombers can inflict by hitting these targets is just absurd. And as you can see here, we still have aircraft that need shooting down, and we still have ground targets that haven't been killed, and we're going to lose anyway. And I don't think it would take a lot to to fix this. Just reduce the amount of damage to your team's ticket counter that a bomber pilot can accomplish by dropping bombs on a big dumb area target. You don't have to reduce the amount of XP and lions that the bomber pilots get for doing it. It's good that bomber pilots now have a useful function in the game, and are reasonably, what's the right word? That it's not so ridiculously hard for a bomber pilot to actually be able to make a contribution. Just reduce the size of the contribution, because we've gone from a situation where previously fighter pilots would look at a bunch of enemy bombers on the enemy team list and go, ha ha, om nom 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 nom, lunchtime, to a situation now where it's exactly the opposite. And you see an enemy team stacked with bombers, particularly on a ground strike mission, and you just think, oh shit, we've lost. By all means, let bomber pilots keep enjoying the increased durability of their aircraft. Let them still have a fighting chance of making it to these area ground targets, and keep the area ground targets in the game. Finally, they've got something that they can actually drop a bomb load on that isn't going to scatter as soon as it sees or hears the air raid siren. Now, I must emphasise that I do think these are good changes. I do think they are big steps in the right direction, and I do think these changes needed to be implemented. However, you've just watched me fly a ground strike mission in fighter aircraft, did my job, successfully defended the ground targets. Not all of them had been knocked out, and yet we lost anyway, despite the fact that the fighter pilots kept up their side of the bargain. And if it's possible for that to happen in a ground strike mission, something's gone wrong somewhere. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you experiencing the same thing, or do you not consider this to be an issue? Have your say in the comments, and we'll see what you think. As always, folks, watch your six, and I'll catch you next time.